Hi, I'm Al Dominic, the host of Looking Ahead. It's Tuesday, December 3rd, and I'm at the NASDAQ market site in Times Square hosting an exclusive event to help leadership teams from public companies navigate unforeseen risks and complex business challenges.
We first met in December, which was a few months after the Dieselgate crisis started. And what we're going to try to do is give you a little bit of a sense for how the company sort of survived and navigated what probably was one of the biggest existential crises that a major company has ever been through. Volkswagen is not only the biggest car maker in the world, but also the biggest company in Germany. So David, why don't you give your perspective, sort of how it started at the beginning for you?
Sure. Well, as Bob was describing, I had been, Volkswagen in Germany was one of my clients. I was in private practice, had been for 20 years. And I thought by moving in-house that there'd be a slight improvement in my quality of life. Well, let's just say that it's been as challenging, but also very interesting. And it's been an interesting, worthwhile experience, but hopefully it will settle down at some point in the near future. So the message that we'd like to convey is that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And if we manage the crisis effectively, then we can learn from it and the company can grow and evolve and become a better company going forward.
So why don't we start a little bit with what happened? The Volkswagen emissions scandal involved literally almost 11 million cars globally. And we literally had problems. We've dealt with problems in New Zealand, South Korea, Israel, the UK, literally around the globe. And on the screen, we have all the big cars. I mean, some of the most popular cars in the world, from the Audi A5 to the VW Golf to the Porsche Cayenne. And the Volkswagen had started advertising something called clean diesel. And the issue with diesel had always been that it polluted more than other types of vehicles, but it also provided really great gas mileage. And so, Volkswagen ran ads, and some of those ads were on the Super Bowl, literally, extolling the virtue of diesel, and, a whole series of ads. And so when the crisis happened, and the crisis involved essentially, a pretty clear and unassailable cheat. The way it works is when you do auto testing for emissions, vehicles are tested on a test bench, and the way the Volkswagen engineers had managed to put this in, they put something called a defeat device in the vehicles, and what that meant was when it was on the test bench, the auto emission system operated differently, and then when it was actually on the road, the emissions were 40 times, as much as 40 times higher. So, this obviously set off huge press internationally. It was, front page news around the world. And the real question was how, the great Volkswagen could have gotten itself enmeshed in what was just a pretty outrageous and clear, cheat scandal. And it started on September 18, 2015, when the EPA served up a notice of violation identifying the fact that there was this big cheat, and then it expanded to cover some of the bigger cars, including, VW Touaregs and Porsche Cayennes, and ultimately, lots of impact on the company's financials. It was a true existential crisis. So, David, why don't we talk a little bit about some of the initial crisis response considerations that we faced when the matter started. Clearly, we were dealing with a high crisis level. And there was a question about how much this would cost. Could the company survive? Would there be a need to bust the company up, maybe sell brands? And none of that's actually happened, which we take as with a certain amount of pride.
And I think that's a very important point, is that when a crisis of this magnitude happens, then all bets are off. And you have to think in terms of, in frameworks or in contexts that you never thought you'd have to think. In Germany, the company's structure is very stable. It's been really a bellwether for the German economy. There's a lot of national pride associated with the company. And so all of a sudden, it is a huge paradigm shift that people are confronted with, possibly the breakup, having to sell a brand or spin-off activities in order to pay fines and penalties. And that gets people thinking, or they need to start thinking, in very different frameworks than they're accustomed to. So just running through the list very quickly, I mean, it's critically important to understand who your stakeholders are. And we'll get to the idea of communication later on, but for example, you need to motivate. We have over 640,000 employees globally, and some of them are, a lot of them are assembly line workers. And you need to be able to communicate effectively with them and understand how to communicate what's going on to them in a way that they don't go home and continue to magnify that negative trend, because that will galvanize in a negative way the way the crisis is being dealt with. When we talk about teeing up the team, critically important that we see clearly what skill sets we're going to need. There's always a tension between sticking with the advisors that you've had previously. You have that trusted advisor, long-term working relationship, but they may not be the best advisors to get you through the crisis. So one message is the crisis is a fundamental shift in the way the company does business and the way the company thinks about itself. So you need to make sure that as you go through the crisis, you're getting the right team, and you may have to change that team as you progress through the crisis. This ranges from outside counsel to PR consultants. Communication is critically important. The financial consultant aspect of it is, as we mentioned, fines and penalties. You may need detailed statistical or economic modeling to be able to determine what the company can withstand, or to maintain your position in a negotiation where you can give and where you can't. One of the things about VW is essentially there's an analogy to the downward spiral in the bank crisis, that it's all driven by liquidity. We need liquidity to be able to produce cars, to be able to sell cars, to generate more liquidity. And to know where you are on that spiral is critically important. So the economics or the financial analysis is crucial. Then there's a whole angle of working effectively with the government and the regulators, because I can say we came in as the newbies because our predecessors were no longer in place. That gave us an opportunity to engage. Just a very brief anecdote, my boss, the global general counsel, introduced us to a panel of rather ill-minded Department of Justice colleagues as the cleaning crew, which was a fantastic icebreaker. But it was a way of saying we have set a new standard for the way we're going to interact, and that interaction with the regulator and with the enforcement agencies is critically important. Communication strategy, I think, is clear. When we talk about involving the boards, this is of primary involvement or importance. We have a different relationship. Our board meets weekly in Germany. So they want to be very, very closely involved in the management of the crisis, but you get the combination of the paradigm shift and the deep level involvement that the board members will want to have, and a lot of interaction is necessary to help them understand it's a foreign environment, it's built upon different legal principles, and it's critically important, I say that always, it's critically important to make sure that the board members are aware and they can engage because they have their duties to the company. And then finally, personnel issues. As I mentioned, you may need to make changes. I'm part of the cleaning crew. I'm one of the new people. That was just the way the crisis evolved. That, as Bob mentioned, we met in December of 2015 as I was on my way to a new position, which turned out to be very different than what I had anticipated.
You know, if you take anything away from what we say this morning, from my perspective, the most important thing in a crisis is not to lawyer up, and that's a funny thing for a lawyer to say. I find that oftentimes people will want a gazillion experts and as many lawyers as they can possibly have in the room. But the problem is you end up with, you don't have a strategy, and everyone is trying to show that they're the smartest person in the room. And what we actually did as the crisis evolved was our team actually shrunk. And it was a much more of a core team of people who were generalists as opposed to specialists. And it was very important to have sort of that seamless team where everyone was working together for the same goal and everyone sort of understood what their roles was, and you didn't have any, interscene fighting going on in the team, which I've seen in other crises where you have multiple law firms and multiple communications people. And it's really important to develop that team and then also to develop credibility with the decision makers in management, because when you think about it, what happened in Volkswagen, they literally have litigation around the world. So there's a real need to educate management, educate the board on how to navigate the crisis. Now, I think it's really important in a crisis to manage expectations. Everyone thinks that, the sky is falling, and it may well be, but you need to set short-term goals and long-term goals, and you can't expect to get out of the crisis in the first week, month, or maybe even years. I mean, we've been working in the Volkswagen matter for almost 4 years now, and we thought it would take a long time to build our way out of this and sort of turn the company around. There's no easy solution when you're accused of, engaging in a massive fraud globally, and you're you have one of the great brands in the world. So you have to sort of manage expectations, expect it will take some time to work through the problem. And then you've got to make sure that you engage in what I call a holistic approach. Now, one of the things we did in Volkswagen, and this was one of a great mantra that we had, which was talking about the need for a global settlement. And by that, what we meant was you didn't want to deal with the problem in a piecemeal way. You wanted to look at it as a interrelated problem, because everything you did interacted with something else. If you settled with a government, say a U.S. government agency, it would have consequences in civil litigation in the United States, and then consequences in litigation, say in Germany or England or in Korea. So you had to sort of deal with it in terms of a multi-dimensional chessboard, with each move having an effect someplace else. So David, maybe talk about what some of our goals were when we got involved in this.
One thing, Bob, maybe before we get into that, is it's critically important to know where you are in the crisis, because as Bob was saying, you may adjust your team, you may adjust your requirements. So it's important to know where you are and see that clearly, because where you were a month or two ago is certainly not where you are, and you need to see the long-term objectives, which are things like preserving the brand. We reach out to the customer. We want to make sure the customer doesn't lose confidence in the car that they're driving. But at the same time, we're not going to do something that puts us in a disadvantageous position from a litigation standpoint. So if we admit something by trying to accommodate our customer or maintain customer loyalty, we have to be very careful that doesn't play badly on the legal side. So going back to the holistic approach, we have to see how that chessboard actually works. Legal exposure, obviously, we were talking about an existential crisis, and we had to bear in mind, and we'll talk a little bit more about silos and the holistic approach as the antidote, because if you have lawyers, we think in a particular way. And that may not be exactly what the company needs at that moment, but you need that dialogue, you need to have the interaction among your core team to be able to pick the right strategy that takes all of these aspects into account. We have to rebuild the customer trust. Fortunately for our brand, for Volkswagen, we were able to finally get sport utility vehicles out there, and they're doing quite well in the market. That is a way of showing the customer that we're not disappearing. There was a fear that VW would simply say, this is enough of a problem, we're going to exit the US market. And that deliberation lasted, I think, about 2 seconds, because it's antithetical to everything the company stands for, and it would completely scrap the work that had been done over decades to build up the brand. So we want to make sure that customers, if they're driving a car that has a defeat device in it, it's very important for them to know that they can continue to drive the car safely and that they are not violating the law. There's a problem with the car and it's going to be resolved, but we as a company are going to stand up for what we've built, and we're going to come to a reasonable resolution, but we're not going to lose the trust of our customers if we can avoid it. And ultimately that leads to shareholder value. As Bob mentioned, the initial impact of the scandal was devastating. We lost half of our share value, and we're on our way back. So hopefully we'll see valuations improving in the coming months and years. But that's the way the market values the company, given the risks that the market perceived.
I think it's important to keep in mind that don't expect, when you have an existential crisis like Volkswagen had, to be able to just turn a switch and turn it around, in a week or month, or it can take, years. And you look at some of the bigger crises, British Petroleum in the issue in the Gulf. That literally went on for 6-7 years, and it cost, I think, $80 billion to resolve. We're at about $20 billion in 4 years. And so you have to plan for the long haul and don't expect, instant improvement. Also, I think communications is so important, because you want to make sure that what the lawyers are saying in court, what the lawyers are saying to the regulators, is consistent with what you're saying to all of your various stakeholders. Now, VW was a really difficult problem and remains a difficult problem because of the sheer scale of the problem. Literally, we had sold these cars around the world. Australia, Korea, South Africa, India, Soviet Union, everywhere you could possibly imagine, these vehicles were sold. And that created a problem where, because the legal systems in every country are different. And in the United States, which is much more of a lawyer's paradise than elsewhere, there's a clear path for bringing class action lawsuits, and regulators tend to be very aggressive. In Europe, traditionally, there has not been as an aggressive a view on, say, civil class actions or even among regulators. And one of the consequences of the VW scandal, I think, is to some extent we've exported the U.S. legal system around the world, and there's a big move now in Europe to adopt something akin to a class action structure. VW, it was in the papers the last couple of days, is litigating what might be described as a class action in the UK over the whole Dieselgate issue. But you have to navigate each one of these jurisdictions. You need different lawyers in each jurisdiction, and you need to make sure that everything you do is coordinated. And one of the things we did in the United States was, I was the National Coordinating Counsel in the US, because we had so much different types of exposure. And even to this day, we have biannual meetings in Germany of all the lawyers from Australia to Israel to Latin America, and we all get together and talk about how we are addressing the problems in our jurisdiction, mindful of the fact that an action in the United States will have an effect outside of the United States. Up on the screen, we just described just the U.S. regulatory landscape, and it's quite amazing when you look at it. Everything from consumer class actions, the Department of Justice on the civil side, the EPA, the FTC. We literally had lawsuits by 50 state attorney generals. People call them AGs, almost governor. And so, think about herding cats and trying to get everyone on board on a settlement, recognizing full well that each side is looking, each stakeholder is looking to get more from the company, and you have to try to navigate what is a really complicated legal landscape.
Absolutely. This is something, at one point we joked that the only people who weren't suing us were the FAA, because we didn't have anything to do with airplanes. It's just the reality that when you produce cars and you put them into the stream of commerce, you're touching so many different, from the consumer claims through the environmental claims, there's just a raft of topics and touch points that result in a regulatory violation or a customer claim of some kind.
And one of the really lucky breaks that Volkswagen got was that Judge Charles Breyer was appointed to be the MDL judge, to be the judge where all of the federal cases would be coordinated in his courtroom. And he's a very creative judge, and he was essentially wanted to see if we could get the cars off the road that had problems as quickly as possible and resolve the cases as quickly as possible. And that actually served Volkswagen's interest, because sometimes when you start a litigation, you can sort of put it on a continuum. There's the case where you should win the case, you can litigate the case, you'll win the case. Then there's a case like this where you've got admitted cheating, you've got claims of senior management involvement, and that's not the kind of case that's going to age well. And so one of the strategies that we adopted was to try to resolve matters as quickly as possible, try to leverage each settlement with the rest. And one of the things you learn when you deal with the government, as I do, is that everyone wants to be there when the settlement is announced. And there's a real rush to join up in the settlement, and that's what happened in our case. But Judge Breyer really promoted that, and it essentially brought all of the competing governmental and even private plaintiff stakeholders and sort of pushed everyone toward a settlement. And we were helped by that man, Robert Mueller, who had left the FBI, and he was the settlement master appointed by Judge Breyer. And the virtue of Bob Mueller was, unlike sort of a Monty Hall type mediator, he was someone who was viewed with a lot of respect by the governmental actors. People in the Department of Justice, the EPA, the state attorney generals all revered Bob Mueller, and he was able to sort of bring all the parties together, which was in the company's interest. So here's a sort of a little bit of a timeline on what happened. The original notice of violation that there was cheating software in the vehicles was in September 2015. We were able to literally announce settlements by April 2016. So just the speed of that, cases can go on for literally years. great for lawyers, bad for the clients. We were able to announce settlements of the 2-liter cases in April 2016, and that was because we literally were working around the clock. And our view was the faster we could put this behind the company, the better. We would preserve the brand. Plus, we actually thought we would get a better deal than if we just dragged it out, because we did not believe that the facts were going to get better for us over time. I mean, David, maybe your perspective on the pressures we were under in the early days?
Well, we recognize not only is it important to get resolution in the United States as quickly as we could, that opens up capacity to deal with what Bob was pointing to earlier, which is the crisis elsewhere in the world. Because of the large distribution of the vehicles worldwide, it was important to say we can get closure with a lot of people in the United States, with the regulators in the United States, and that became one of our primary objectives, was to tie up as many loose ends in the U.S. as we could as early as possible.
And that was because we thought the U.S. was the most dangerous jurisdiction in terms of having the most developed plaintiffs' bar, having the most aggressive regulators, and that was a place where we thought, if we could resolve the U.S. quickly, maybe, pay a lot of money, which we did, we might actually save billions of dollars. And, the total cost so far, depending on how you look at it, is, roughly $20 billion. Well, that number doesn't take into account fully the amount that we've made from actually buying back cars and then selling them, and also preserving brand value. But speed actually worked to our advantage, because had we delayed, I think these cases would have gotten worse over time. So that, for example, allegations were made, and there was actually an indictment of the former CEO, which came after the settlements that we were able to reach. Maybe talk a little bit, David, about some of the elements of our initial 2-liter settlement.
Bob, before we get to that, one thought is when the company's put under the microscope and you have these sorts of problems, then things come out of the woodwork. And there's more scrutiny and more issues that may have been under the radar come up, and you just end up with more crises and more challenges, which you then have to deal with on top of what you're already aware of as a crisis. In terms of the structure, this is actually it's a new way to resolve the claims. The 10 billion piece is, first of all, taking care of consumers, and this is a court-endorsed, court-entered settlement. I believe at this point we're done with all of the buybacks and modifications of the 2- and 3-liter vehicles. Some of them are still available, but the market has been very receptive to the modified vehicles.
We can sell you some if you want some.
There are still some left if you want, but
great fuel mileage.
And now they are compliant vehicles. The mitigation trust was essentially saying that the vehicles had put the NOx, is the nitrous oxide pollutant that is so damaging to the environment. And the idea was that for every quantity, every unit of damage that was done to the environment by the vehicles not complying with environmental standards, the company ended up putting the $2.7 billion into that trust. And then the ZEV investments, you'll see that we have a subsidiary called Electrify America. Their task, and this is a product of the settlement, is to build out the electric charging infrastructure on a brand neutral basis across the United States and especially in California. So if you have range anxiety, Electrify America is one of the companies that's going to help you with your electric vehicle as your range improves, hopefully getting you from 200 to 300, maybe even more miles of range. Having a DC fast charger on your travel route will mean that you can just get that cup of coffee and charge your car at the same time and then continue your journey. So it's a different way of thinking about it, but it's also a matter of addressing the lack of awareness of electric vehicles. It's always surprising to see how little awareness there is, even in California, which we think of as sort of the birthplace or the hotspot for electric vehicles. Surveys indicate that there's not as much awareness of electric vehicles as there could be. So that was a part of the task as well. So this was a cumulative strategy to try to make right what had been done improperly in terms of addressing our customers and giving them vehicles that they could be proud to drive, dealing with the mitigation of the damage that was done to the environment, and then also building toward the future, which we see as being electric vehicles with a robust charging infrastructure.
Now, we ultimately had to do even more settlements. I mean, I've never settled so many cases in my life. I'd always been proud of the fact that my total lifetime settlements were under $1 billion until Volkswagen came along. But we had to settle with the state attorney generals, which was really hurting cats. Then we had to settle with our dealers. And then we had to, by the time, and this is an interesting we had to enter into a guilty plea with the Department of Justice. And then we had to settle the 3-liter cases. And we did all of this, pretty much by early 2017. And what was interesting was, there was a little bit of a rush, and I always called it the Obama administration's going out of business sale, because we were able to get to basically bring down the settlement demands as the administration was changing. And, the people who had been, investigating this wanted to be on the podium when the resolution was announced and not have it kicked to another administration. And obviously from the client standpoint, you'd been working with these folks for months, and you wanted to try to get it done. So all of the announcements came literally, 9 days before the Obama administration was done. And, then what happened was, and this is sort of the phase that we're going through right now, there was a lot of cooperation with the Department of Justice, and, the scope of the scandal and, who knew about it, the Watergate question, who knew what when, became a real focus. And the company had to cooperate with the Justice Department and provide lots of information. This chart is one that I take a lot of pride in. At the bottom of the scandal, and look at the stock price, from north of 200, it had literally got down as low as, 100 euros a share. And as of now, it's roughly, 173. That's a big recovery. And what was interesting is, as we did settlements and spent billions of dollars, the stock price would actually go up, which is, something that's somewhat counterintuitive, but the market doesn't like uncertainty. And one of the things about the settlements was we were cabining the risk, and we were moving forward, we were preserving the brand. And that was, you could, just looking at the stock price chart, you see that, it dropped very quickly, and it's been a slow road, going up. But, it's over time, it's largely, it's up, 70 euros from the bottom. It's not all the way back yet. But if the company had, tried to drag this thing out, not had a global settlement strategy, fought with the regulators, fought with the plaintiffs' lawyers would have made money, but it would not have been in the interest of the shareholders of Volkswagen. And so when you have a situation where the company that you're involved with has a serious problem, it's much smarter, in my view, to try to resolve it as fast as you can and not let the problem fester and go on for literally years. I mean, David, maybe your reaction?
Absolutely right. The issue for us was to get closure as quickly as we could because of the uncertainty. We didn't know what we'd be. I mean, Bob pointed to the idea that those regulators want to be on the podium to announce the settlement, but there's also that eliminating the uncertainty with what would we get in the new administration, and where would we start the discussion, which of the people involved in the case would remain and who would leave, so that it was in everyone's interest to wrap up as much as we could, as quickly as we could. So that was part of the success story, I think.
In terms of where we are now at this point in time, there's still a fair bit of litigation. We have litigation in the United States with the SEC. We have opt-out litigation. These are sort of I would describe them as the sort of the bottom tier of the plaintiff's bar, where they will literally be, representing, a handful of car owners. And the way the laws work in the United States, you can litigate one of these cases, and if the attorneys run up $500,000 in fees and recover $10,000, you're on the hook for $510,000, which is a heck of a system when you think about it. And we're in the process of trying to resolve those cases, but we've largely cleaned up the U.S. situation within a year, which, as far as I know, is probably the fastest that anyone was able to resolve this kind of a crisis and allow the company to move on. We're now working, and part of the criminal settlement was having a monitor, and former Deputy Attorney General Larry Thompson is our monitor, and that's a pretty big undertaking, because what a monitor and a monitor's team does is really sort of look at all of your compliance and related systems and really try to see if changes can be made to avoid, a new problem, down the road. Maybe David, what's been your experience working with the monitor?
The focus for the monitorship is to ensure that nothing of this magnitude or of this nature recurs with VW. And so it's one of the hard parts is we're an engineering company. So as far as we're concerned, we take an issue, we break it down to its constituent parts, we solve the parts, we put it all back together, and we've solved the problem. But it's really about the culture. It's about bringing about a transformation in the company. And so what the monitor is trying to do is guide the company toward the kind of culture where this sort of conduct cannot recur. And that's not something that necessarily breaks into constituent parts terribly well. There are a lot of aspects or a lot of projects or tasks or initiatives that can support that cultural change, but it's really a critically important part to get people thinking differently about their relationship to the company and their relationship to other stakeholders. So the monitorship has been a very helpful tool in bringing about change. I would say in a hopeful way that our company has always been good at marginal incremental improvements, and we probably would have continued to improve the diesel technology until nobody wanted to buy a diesel, and the company, it would be a buggy whip situation. We would have the best diesel vehicles and no one would want to buy them. So the existential crisis opened the company up to opportunities to grow and change and transform its culture so that it is able to look into a future which has electric vehicles and different concepts of mobility. I'm not sure that the company would have been receptive to that 5 years ago. Matter of fact, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't have been. So something positive comes out of this, and that's not a direct result of the monitorship, but the transformation in thinking and the culture is what enables the company to look into the 21st century and not become the buggy whip example of diesel.
I mean, a way to think about it is a crisis like this is just an extreme shock to the system. I mean, Volkswagen was a company that basically printed money. It had great brands, and they'd been in existence for a really long time. And, we went to meetings where how this was all going to turn out was not very clear until you actually saw what was going to happen going forward. I think again, the big takeaways just from my experience working on this case are, and it's important for folks, again, take away one thing. If you needed a knee replacement, you would not want 5 doctors working on your knee all at once. You'd want one. And the tendency to over-lawyer and hire too many advisors and create the problem where everyone wants to prove they're the smartest person in the room is really something that in a crisis, I actually think you have to reduce the size of your team. You need a really team that works together and is very focused. I think communications becomes really important, and making sure that those communications are consistent and the message is one that is repeated and one that is honest. A big mistake companies can make initially is to downplay the crisis. There's such a tendency to want to say things aren't as bad as you think they are. The problem is you don't want to be in a situation where when the facts ultimately come out, it looks like the management team or the lawyers were not being candid with regulators, with other stakeholders. And one of the things in this case, we recognized there was a big problem from day one. And whenever I would go into court and appear before Judge Breyer, I ate a lot of humble pie. I didn't, say, hey, we didn't do anything wrong. We kept saying, our goal here is to make things right for consumers, for our customers, and for the environment, and to do so as fast as we could. Now, he obviously wanted to hear that, but that was the same message that the company CEO was making. It was the same message that our PR people were making, and so we had that consistent, seamless message. And then, I think it's important to make the assessment at the very beginning. Is this a case that you're going to litigate for years and years and years, or is this one where you're much better off, getting past the problem and trying to resolve it as fast as you can? And, I believe that, global settlements are often very much in companies' interest. And you look at, cases out there now like the opioids matter, for example. They're trying to resolve those cases, with as many stakeholders as they can. It's not that easy to do. But if you can do it, you end up putting the problem behind the company as fast as you can. And the net effect is that certainty will have a positive, impact on your stock price, which is ultimately what it's about. David?
My takeaways would be, if you are in a crisis, see it with clear eyes. Make sure you understand the scope, the magnitude. Don't overestimate or be overly optimistic about how quickly it will pass. We're looking at now year 4 heading toward year 5 of our crisis, and having the right team on board, and also it becomes a marathon rather than a sprint. So make sure you have a team with redundancy, with overlap, with capabilities to carry you through the crisis. And as Bob pointed out, I can only underscore, get the right people on your core team and make sure that you're seeing these things holistically, because it may not be, whatever crisis you may face may not be as intricate and as complicated and as global as the crisis that we've experienced, but I can say you want to have the right people on the team. Their egos don't get in the way. They play well with the kids in the sandbox, and they're working toward resolving the complication and the crisis as quickly and as smoothly as they possibly can, because there's no room for people to get in the way of a positive resolution.
And also, don't expect, if it's a really big crisis like this one, that it's going to be solved in a day or a month or a year. And expectation management is really important. You've got to have expectation management with your board. You've got to have expectation management with your employees, and you need to have expectation management with your shareholders. And I think if you have a strategy that's clearly articulated, stakeholders will recognize that it will take time to turn the page and to get past the crisis.